So first, well, Adam asked two questions here in the thread of the post where we announced this session. The first one is if it's possible to build a calendar feature in Bravo. So we don't have a calendar component at the moment available, so it's not possible to just add a native calendar. However, you can combine some of the elements that Bravo offers, and depending on what exactly you want to use the calendar for can be a solution. So some users in the past have used normal lists, for instance, where they get for instance, you create a container that takes a specific width of the screen. And when you connect that to a list that, for instance, returns all the days for a month, then that will populate into several elements in the screen, and it will look kind of a calendar. But you will need to set up that list component, and then you need to set up the backend so it returns the specific days. And then with that and conditional visibility, you can do some stuff. So you could also use the active and default states to change how it's of those days look like, and you can trigger remote actions as well with that. You could even have like instead of using the normal stateful component, you could use the stateful input and have some button acting like a submit button. So the user, for instance, selects a couple of days and they hit send, and then you get that information. So you can try to combine those components to build something like that. So it depends on what you would like to do. And then the second one, well, you could same thing. If you use conditional visibility, you can do something like that, because you can have different states for the same component, so you can control what you display in the screen. We don't have like this kind of timer component either, but for instance, the progress bar could be something you can try. Maybe, I mean, having like as many states as like 240 would be a bit too much, but maybe you can have like I don't know, 5 or 6 separate different states for the bar, and depending on the actual number here, you can control from the backend which of those states you display. So you can play with that and try to do something with all this. Okay, so I hope that helped. Now I will go. I have a set of questions here, but anytime if you have any question, just ask in the chat. I will be just having a look now and then and see if there is any questions there. So we can go now through the next one. Well, this is a question from a user asking if they build something like an Airbnb app, if they can like see all the houses, or I guess maybe like specific information, considering that they use which user logged in. So you can control all of that with the user variables. Basically, we have a tutorial in the help center that explains how to do that. And we even have an Airbnb clone app that you can have a look at. I think it's built with Chano. So I hope that's useful for this user. Okay. Next question. So Timothy is asking how they can add a QR code generator. Basically, a QR code is like it's a URL in a special format that you can read with your phone, and it depends on what you want to accomplish here. But for instance, if you want to have like an application with a user login where each user has its own QR code, for instance, for any purpose, you will need to generate the QR in the backend. Or you could even, like some user said here, you can use an existing service like that. There is plenty of them that translates a normal URL into a QR code, and use that maybe as a web view or maybe connecting it to the backend. So you generate those QR codes and then use them in the application. And then we have, on the other side of things, we have the QR code reader available for Bravo apps. So you can have a QR code reader inside your app as well. Okay, next. We have a user. Actually, I chose this one because it's a pretty common problem for a lot of users. This user was struggling to bind data into their screen. So I guess here what they want to do is bind a text element to a text data. And as you can see here, there is no available element in their API request. And this can be due to several reasons. One of them could be that this request actually looks like a list request. So in this case, you will first need to bind a container to a text element. And once you do that, here it doesn't appear, but there is like a container UI element with a container property. And that one you will need to bind to a list data. And once you do that, then you will probably be able to bind the individual text element. So just to explain this a bit better, I chose one of our sample apps. Here, there is a list item element. So this will be basically this will be converted into a list in the application. So here you see there is this container property that needs to be bound to a special data item that is records. Here the name is records because that's the default name for Airtable, and we have an Airtable wizard, so it will always be records unless you change that. But if you come here, I think this is actually that request. Yeah, places list. You will see if you send a test request that you have this this data item here. This is a reference to the whole table. So if we open the Airtable here, basically that's the data item you need to bind to this container property. So Bravo knows this is going to be a list. And this, as I said, this makes reference to the whole table. So then basically that will be the one you need to bind to the container property, which is the wrapper of everything. And then here, individually, you will have the text elements. So for instance, places, it's going to be this thing here. Actually, it's not chosen here. I don't know why, but it should be chosen. And then here you can change its name. So if this is the data records fields places, you will need to find the corresponding data item here. It's going to be this one. And here you can change the name. And the name is the thing you will see here. So that's the setup for a list. But imagine if you are like on a detail page, so you don't want this to be populated into a list, but into a just one element. You can also do that, but in that case, you will need to unbind this and set it to none. So now you will see everything is unbound, and you will need to bind individually these elements here. So if we try to bind the text and we use the same request, you will see that now there is no element available. And there is a reason for that, and is that we are selecting here all the data items that have the empty bracket. If they have an empty bracket, they will make reference, instead of a single field, let's say we want to bind a Concagua. These individual items are making reference to the whole column. So this is the type of data we will need to bind if we are binding a list. But if we are binding an individual item, which is probably if normally we will be using the detail request, which is already set up for that. Yeah, we need to provide an ID. Just wait. This is kind of basic stuff, but still it's easy to get lost sometime. So here, as you can see, there is no empty bracket thing. So this makes reference to just one single field here. So it will be one of these. And this is the one we need to bind to the other request. But for instance, let's imagine we have the list request when we want to bind just the first element. Then we will need to choose here one element. This is going to be the first one. And let's say we want to bind this places item. So then we will need to look for it here. We will find it because it has a 0 index here. And we will just say single text. And then if we come here, probably we will be able to bind it. Yeah, because we are now making reference to specifically the 0 element of the table instead of just the whole column. And that's probably the reason why this user wasn't being able to bind anything, because they will probably, as this is, I guess, a list request, probably they are selecting the list items instead of the individual ones. Okay, so that was it. In any case, if this user sees this session and then they are still struggling, they can just explain further what they tried and what they want to accomplish, so we can help. Okay, so we can go to the next one. I will check if there is any comments. Not yet. So I have 2 questions more here. So Joey here is asking if it's possible to have a list detail setup. Okay, so it's definitely possible. The only thing that you always need to take care of when you have several screens connected to each other is that you are passing the corresponding parameters. So for instance, let's say you have let's start with just this single first 2 pages, which is the list and detail. That's easy because you will have here the list request kind of, and here you would have a detail request. And always a detail request will have an ID in the URL that you need to get from the list request. And that's basically bound by setting the same name in the detail request URL variable you have in the URL. It's normally something like ID if you use our table, because we generate that already. And then you need to make sure you have a data item called ID in the list request. So if you want to add a further detail page, which I guess is going to be related to the same element here, you will just need to make sure that in this detail request, you have a parameter in the URL as well. I mean, it could be a URL, could be the JSON body, whatever you are using a variable with like $sign and brackets. That's going to be a dynamic value depending on which state of the app you are in. So here, if the user is going from a detailed page for a specific element, let's say the first element of the table, and then this detail page is going to be for the same element, you need to make sure that here you are binding a request that has a variable in the URL. Let's say it's called ID, and that in this detail request, you are returning and selecting a data item that is called ID as well, and is the actual ID of the element you are returning here. So you just need to make sure those are the same. And then actually you can be creative, and I don't know, for instance, you don't need to stick to a specific pattern when it comes to creating this kind of setups. You can have, let's say, a list page with like list of cities. Then you could have a detail page with more information about one city, and then you can have inside this same request screen, you can have a list of attractions in that city, and then you can have even a new detail request showing detailed information about its attraction. So you could have like, as many levels as you want. The only thing you need to take care of is that the requests are connected the same way I told you before. We have tutorials in our help center as well for different cases, but you can just be creative and go out of those more fixed structures and create what you want actually. Okay, so should be done, this one. And then the final one I selected here is about creating like multiple pages into a single database entry. So I guess this would be like, I don't know, for instance, 3 pages with 3 forms, and you want to save all the information into one single form, into one single row. So here basically what you can do, and actually some users have already done that in the past, is in the first screen you can have a post request that creates a row in your database, and then in the second screen you can create a patch request that targets that specific row that you created in the first screen with the post, because a patch request will be editing an existing record instead of creating a new one, and that's, I guess, what the user wants here. So the tricky part here is being able to target that specific row, because a patch request will always need an ID, so they know the patch request knows what record it needs to edit. So here there are several strategies. For instance, if you have already logged in with a user, you will have a user ID, and what you can do is in the first post request send along that user ID and store that in the database. And then in the second screen, you can actually, apart from binding the patch request to the form, you can also bind a get request to get information from your database. And here, what you could do is create a filter in the get request that returns for specific user ID all the entries they have created. So you can even like sort it, so the latest entry is the first, and you can select that first one, and that one will have the ID of the record the user created in the post request. And then using the same technique for like least detail pages, you can connect that get request ID and send it in the patch request JSON body in this case, because you will need to send information. And so the patch request would target specifically that record of the table. And then you can edit, let's say, the information the user submitted in the first page, and you can concatenate as many screens as you want here. We will try to create like more written and video tutorials showing this, because maybe it's a bit complex if you don't see it in context, but the general idea would be that just if you manage to pass all those data from one screen to another and from one request to another, sometimes it's a bit more tricky than other times depending on the use case, but you can accomplish all these structures by doing that.